It was 2:47 in the morning when I called my mother. I remember the time because I had been watching it on the microwave clock in the hospital waiting room, the green numbers, the way they didn't move fast enough. My daughter Nora was 6 years old and they had taken her through a set of doors I was not allowed to follow through. And I had already called my husband, who was 2 states away for work, and I had already called his mother, who was on her way, and now I was calling mine. 43 minutes I had been waiting. I had the phone to my ear and I could hear my mother's house. The particular silence of a home that has been asleep for hours, the way the ring sounds different at night. She picked up on the 4th ring. My husband Marco and I had tried to open a food business 2 years earlier. A small catering operation, weekends, events, nothing dramatic. We had spent $18,000 we mostly didn't have, and it had not worked, and we had spent another year paying down what it cost us to close it. Marco picked up a regional sales job that kept him on the road 3 weeks out of 4. I was freelancing, content writing, some copy editing from a second bedroom we called an office because it had a desk. We were fine. We were not comfortable, but we were fine. Nora had been getting sick more often than she used to. Small things that were taking longer to resolve. Her pediatrician had mentioned something about her immune response that I had filed in the back of my mind and not fully opened yet. That night in February, she had been running a high fever for 2 days when her breathing changed. I noticed it at 2 a.m. By 2:04 I had her in the car. So when my mother answered the phone that night, I told her what was happening. I told her the fever had spiked. I told her I was alone and I didn't know yet what was wrong. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know we don't do well in hospitals, Diane." I heard my father's voice in the background. Not words, just the low register of him waking up and asking what was happening. My mother said to him, not to me, "It's Diane. Nora has a fever." A fever. That is what she called it to him. And then she said to me, "Call us when you know more. We'll come when she's settled, we don't want to be in the way." She hung up at 2:51. I put the phone in my lap. I looked at the green numbers. The waiting room had 4 other people in it. One of them, a man in his 60s, caught my eye and nodded at me in a way that said I'm sorry, even though he didn't know what had just happened. Only that something had. Marco's mother, Elena, arrived at 4:15. She brought coffee I didn't ask for and she sat next to me and she did not say anything for a long time, which was the exact right thing. Nora had croup, severe but manageable. They kept her until morning. By 6 a.m. she was sitting up and asking about her stuffed rabbit. I called my mother to let her know. She said, "Oh good. We worried all night." I did not say what I was thinking. I drove home in the early light and I put Nora in my bed and I watched her breathe and I made a decision that I did not announce to anyone. The next 11 months were a kind of education. Nora's immune issues turned out to be real. Not catastrophic, we never reached catastrophic, but real enough that she was in and out of specialist offices for months. An immunologist at the Children's Hospital. A follow-up pulmonologist. Tests I had to learn to pronounce. Forms I had to learn to read. Marco's job paid for our insurance, which was the thing that kept us from real disaster. But the co-pays were not small, and the time I lost to appointments was not nothing. I kept a spreadsheet. I am not a person who naturally keeps spreadsheets, but I kept one. Every appointment, every copay, every specialist referral. Every week I moved a contract deadline to take her somewhere. My parents called every Sunday. They asked about Nora in a general way. They did not ask about the bills. They did not offer. I did not ask. My mother, I later found out, was telling people at her church that Nora was going through some things, and that they were very involved as grandparents. I heard this from my cousin Patrice, who mentioned it without meaning to. She thought I knew. I did not know. I thought about calling my mother about it exactly once in October, when Nora had a hard week and I was behind on 2 projects and Marco was in Dallas and I was standing in the kitchen at midnight eating cereal because I had forgotten to eat dinner. I picked up the phone. I put it back down. Not because I was being strategic. Because I knew what she would say, and I was too tired to hear it. Here is what I did instead. I called my father. Not about the fight I wasn't having with my mother. About a different thing entirely. My father had, for years, been slowly writing down his family history. Not in a book, he would have considered that pretentious, but in a series of notebooks. Black and white marbled composition books, the kind from the drugstore. Names, dates, old addresses, fragments of stories from his parents and grandparents. He had started when his own mother died, and he had been adding to it for 15 years, and no one in the family had ever paid much attention to it. I had always asked about it when I saw him. He liked that, so I called him about the notebooks. I asked if he had gotten any further with his grandfather's service record. He hadn't, but he told me about it for 40 minutes. It was the best 40 minutes I had in months. After we hung up, he called back 2 minutes later. "I want to show you something when you come at Christmas," he said. "Don't let me forget." "I won't," I said. "You never do," he said. That is the kind of thing that sounds like nothing and is actually everything. If you've ever quietly carried something heavier than your budget, the appointments no one drove you to, the nights no one sat through with you. Comment Tuesday at 4 a.m. below and subscribe. Because this does not end where you think it ends. I came at Christmas. Marco came too with Nora, who was doing better by then. The immunologist had found a manageable protocol. The scary winter was mostly behind us. We stayed 4 days. On the second night, after dinner, my father asked me to help him find something in his study. His study was a back room with a metal filing cabinet and a card table and a lamp that had been there since I was 7. He had a system that looked like no system at all but which he could navigate perfectly in the dark. He opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet and moved some folders. He was looking for the service records he'd mentioned, which he had gotten from the county archives. I was helping him sort through it when I noticed, under a hanging file labeled insurance, a plain white envelope with my name on it. Not Diane and Marco, just Diane. In his handwriting. I looked at it for a moment. I did not open it. I put the hanging file back carefully and slid it behind the others, and I did not say anything, and my father, who had been looking at the lamp, not at me, turned back to the cabinet. "Got it," he said, pulling out a different folder entirely. We sat at the card table and he showed me his grandfather's discharge papers. And then after a while he said, "You'll drive me to an appointment Thursday." Not a question. "What appointment?" I said. "Downtown." "You'll drive me." "Okay," I said. He went back to the papers. I was there until Wednesday. We didn't go to the appointment. He said it was moved. But something about the way he said it the first time stayed with me. He had said it like a man finishing a sentence he had started a long time ago. That Christmas was a good one. Nora sat in my father's lap on Christmas Eve and he read to her from one of the composition notebooks. Not the names and dates, but a story about his own grandmother crossing somewhere cold, a river or a bay. He wasn't sure which in winter. Nora said, "Was she scared?" He said, "She never said." But she kept going. My mother made her pie, the one with the brown sugar top, and we ate too much and someone put on music and my father danced once briefly with my mother, and then sat back down and watched the rest of us. I made a joke about his dancing. He pointed at me in mock warning. He let me have the last word. After Nora was in bed and Marco was cleaning up, I sat with my father for a while. He had one of the composition notebooks on his knee, but he wasn't writing in it. "Do you have enough help, Diane?" he said. It was the first time he had asked anything like it. "We're managing," I said. He looked at me. "That's not what I asked," he said. I didn't know what to say to that. So I deflected the way I always did with him. I made a joke about the spreadsheet. He smiled. He went to bed at 9:30. He said goodnight to me in the hallway. He looked at me for a moment longer than usual. I went back to the living room and finished the wine. The call came 6 weeks later. My mother's voice was flat in a specific way. Controlled. She had been the first one up, and she had found him still in bed. And she had known before she touched his shoulder. I knew before she finished the sentence. My father had a heart condition he had been managing for 2 years. He had not told me. He had not told my brother Paul. I don't know who he told, if anyone. When I arrived at the house that afternoon, I walked through the kitchen and I saw his mug in the drying rack. Washed. Upside down. He had washed it before he went to bed. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the counter. My mother was on the phone in the other room. I could hear her telling someone the arrangements would be on Saturday. My brother Paul arrived an hour after I did. The first thing he said when he came through the door, not to me but to the room, was, "Did he have a will?" My mother looked up from her phone. I said nothing. I went to help with the dishes. The funeral was on a Saturday in late February, almost exactly 1 year after the night in the waiting room with the green clock. My mother wore black and she received people at the door and she held hands and she said, more than once in the receiving line, "He went peacefully, he had a good life, we were very close at the end." Very close at the end. I stood to the side and I watched her work the line. She was good at it. She is a person who is good at performing the thing she thinks is required. And grief was something she understood as a performance. She believed in the performance. I don't mean she was faking, she was genuinely sad. But grief for her had always been something you did in front of people correctly, and she was doing it correctly. At one point, a woman from her church, someone who had heard the version where my parents were very involved grandparents, looked at me and said softly, "Your mother is such a tower of strength for your family." I looked at her. I said, "She is." And I turned back to the room. Near the end of the service, a woman in a dark coat approached me. She was perhaps 60, small with good posture. She handed me a card. The card said, "Ellen Marsh, estate attorney." She looked at me for a moment. She gave me a small nod. Not the polite nod of a stranger. The nod of someone who has read a document and is aware of what it says. The reading was 12 days later at a law office downtown. The one downtown. I understood, when I saw the address on the card, why my father had said what he said about Thursday. He had been going to see Ellen Marsh. My mother came dressed carefully. My brother Paul came with his wife, Janet, who is an organizer of things and had already begun organizing this. Paul had explained to me twice in the days since the funeral that he was sure Dad had wanted things to be simple and fair. He said simple and fair the way people say things they have decided means something specific that benefits them. In the waiting room before Ellen Marsh came out, my mother said, just loud enough to Paul as if I might not hear, "I just hope your father had the sense to keep things clear." She had her hands folded in her lap. Paul nodded. I looked at the window. Ellen Marsh brought us into a conference room. She had 2 assistants. She had a document that was longer than any of us expected. My father, it turned out, had assets none of us had known the full extent of. A life insurance policy. A small portfolio he had been building since the 1980s, index funds, nothing complicated, just time. The house owned outright. A savings account with a balance that made Paul's wife Janet sit up straighter when Ellen read it aloud. My mother did not react. I think she knew most of this. What she did not know, what none of us knew, was what he had written in the distribution section. Ellen Marsh read it plainly. She did not editorialize. My father had left the house to my mother. He had left a portion of the portfolio to Paul. He had left a larger portion to me. He had also attached a separate accounting document, something he had clearly prepared over time, that listed every sum of money he had given or loaned to each of his children over the years. Paul's column had loans going back 15 years, money for a car, a down payment, a business that had failed. All of it listed not as gifts, as advances. The document said, in my father's own language, "These amounts are to be deducted from Paul's share before distribution." My mother's face did not move. Paul said, "That's not. He never said these were loans." And then Ellen Marsh read the line my father had written at the top of the accounting section. A single sentence in his handwriting that had been transcribed into the legal document. It said, "I know what showing up costs. I know who paid it." My mother looked at me. And then she said the first thing she said, the most revealing thing, she said, "He wouldn't have done this without being influenced." The room was very quiet. My brother's wife Janet stood up slightly, then sat back down. Ellen Marsh looked at the document. I stood up. I did not give a speech. I said, "He washed his mug before he went to bed. That's who he was." I was not talking to my mother. I was talking to Paul because Paul had been his son longer and had remembered him less. I picked up my copy of the document, and I walked out of the conference room. Paul contested. Took 4 months and went nowhere. My father had been precise. Ellen Marsh had made sure of it. The accounting was thorough and the language was clean, and there was a signed addendum dated November, 2 months before he died. November, which was when I had come home for Thanksgiving and called him about the notebooks, and he had called back 2 minutes later about Thursday. He had already signed the addendum in November. He had been watching for a long time. Paul did not speak to me for 6 weeks after the contest failed. His wife Janet called me first, not him, 3 months later. She said she was sorry. She said she had told him to stop a long time ago. She cried a little. I believe her. I told her I didn't hold it against her. I didn't. My mother did not contest. She received what my father had left her, and she went quiet in the way she goes quiet about things she has decided not to address. She called me once 2 months later to talk about Nora. She asked how she was doing. I told her Nora was doing well. She said, "I'm glad." I believe she meant it. The version of herself she had performed at the funeral, the close family, the tower of strength, the involved grandmother, that version did not survive Ellen Marsh's conference room. Not because anyone announced it had ended, but because the people in that room had seen what the document said, and they had seen what she said first when she heard it, and now they knew the order in which she thought about things. That is a thing you can't unsay. My father had been making notes in the composition books for 15 years. When I went through them, which took several months because there were 14 of them, I found what he had been building. It was a complete family history. Names, dates, immigration records, military records, photographs he had written captions for on small sticky notes. It was meticulous and it was tender, and it was the work of a person who understood that the people who came before you are not gone, they are just out of earshot. I found a note in the last notebook, in handwriting that was a little less certain than the earlier entries. It said, "For Nora when she's ready." I had it transcribed and designed and printed. With part of what he left me, I set up a small fund. I called it the Ray Kowalski Family Archive Fund after my father, that pays for families in underserved communities to access genealogical records, vital records, immigration documents, military files. The things that cost $60 to retrieve and change everything about how a family knows itself. It helps about 40 families a year. It is not large, but it is real. And it does the specific thing he believed in. It tells people where they come from. His mug is on my desk. The brown one with the chip in the handle that he refused to throw out because it held heat well. The composition notebooks are on a shelf in Nora's room. She is 9 now, and she is doing well, and sometimes she takes one down and looks at the photographs. The white envelope with my name on it was also in the filing cabinet, inside the hanging file I had put back. It contained a letter, 3 pages, in his handwriting. I will not tell you what it said. Some things are not for the telling. I will tell you that I read it 4 times and that the last paragraph answered every question I had been asking quietly, since I was 23 years old. I would give back everything in that filing cabinet for one more Tuesday night on the phone with him about his grandfather's service record. That is the plain fact of it. My father was not a loud man. He did not make speeches. He did not explain himself. He watched and he noted and he recorded, and in the end he told the truth in the one room where it could not be walked back from. The moral is not that the right people always win. Sometimes they don't. The moral is, the people who show up and stay quiet and do the work while everyone else is managing the optics, they are not invisible. Someone always sees. Call the person who showed up for you while you still can. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And drop where you're listening from. I read every single one. See you in the next story.